share. And we are going to record this for the lovely folks who couldn't be here because they are in other places, other commitments. Okay, so welcome again. Pia once taught me a little bit of sign language. This is welcome, so screenshot that if you need it for future reference. Again, I'm Danny Spitzberg. I'm based in Oakland, California. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a user researcher. I met Cyd some time ago, but we'll get to that. I'm part of the Design Justice Network. Victoria is the main steward of all things operations. She'll introduce herself. And with Pia, I'm part of the Principles at Work working group, which is taking design justice principles and seeing how they apply mostly in professionalized workplaces and other places too, where it's a little harder to see them visible, to see design justice in action. We usually start out in Design Justice Network doing land acknowledgements. So myself, Cyd, Pia, in the Bay Area, we are on the traditional and unceded land of the Chochenyo and Ohlone peoples. And you can find where you are if you go to native-land.ca. So if you haven't already, and if you're just joining us, we can use the notepad that's linked to here to do introductions. And you can also add where you're based if you want to use that link. The reason we do this, and I think it's a very appropriate gesture and commitment as user researchers, is because we deal in knowledge, we deal in insights, whatever you want to call them. And by lifting up and undoing some erasure of where we are based in the land that we're on, it makes people more conscious of that. It helps people take that into account. And we can build on that small bit of knowledge and that fact for other things we do in our lives. So again, I encourage you to check out native-land.ca, see where you're based. And also I encourage you to introduce yourselves. So here's what we're doing today. Give a little bit of an arc, then I'll hand it over to Pia, and then we'll hand it over to Cyd. Welcome. So we did that. Welcome, everybody. One more time. We're going to have a talk with Cyd Harrell, who's a user researcher and has a new book. There are the notes again. If you are so inclined, we'll have a Q&A after the talk. Then we'll do some breakouts for folks to meet one another in smaller groups and to process a little bit. Then we'll do some report backs and reflections, and we'll say goodbye. So it'll go fast. This is being recorded as well, as I mentioned, as Victoria has hit the button. So if you want to watch it later, you have to go, no problem. And any other housekeeping, Victoria? Of course, you're welcome to choose yourself in Design Justice, please.
No housekeeping, but I'm Victoria. I recognize lots of you, and it's awesome to see you all here. Yeah, let's just start.
Okay, Pia, all you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much, and major kudos to Danny and Victoria for organizing this. I'm just the sidekick that helps out from time to time. But without further ado, Cyd and Danny actually met 4 years ago, nerding out on all things user research. I'm also a researcher, and I'm currently doing my first foray in civic tech. But clearly, this is not Cyd's first time in the civic tech arena. A fun fact about Cyd is that she's also a poet. So to introduce her, stealing from Marissa Levine's idea, I have a haiku. Cyd Harrell is this. She is also that plus more, a superhero ready. Now, granted, I'm clearly not a writer, but it was my best attempt. But to give a more clear picture of what she does, she's currently a civic design consultant at 575. Not to mention a service design lead at the Judicial Council of California. But in the past, she's also been the chief of staff of 18F and a product director for Code of America. But let's not forget about the TED Talk, the book. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Cyd to share more about her work, her book, and what the future holds for her. Take it away, Cyd.
Thank you, Pia. That was an amazing surprise. I absolutely love it. I'm going to, I think, share my screen. And you should hopefully see a question that we can all start with. I come from a perspective of civic tech or civic design. And I want to acknowledge I've just seen a few names go by and some that I recognize, and it's very exciting to have people from lots of different perspectives on design justice in here. So generally, the civic tech field thinks of itself as trying to create public goods as good as the ones that we can get in private sector or commercial arenas in our lives. And I think we are starting to come to terms with a goal of making public digital infrastructure as good as it can be too. Complicated enterprise. This is only in the United States, but if we talk about just government as entities that we might engage with as civic technologists or civic designers, we have 50 states, never mind the federal government, which is one of the largest institutions in the world. We have around 3,000 counties and close to 20,000 cities and towns. That doesn't mention the tribal governments that are part of the American sphere, even though they have independent treaties with the federal government. Doesn't mention the water districts, air quality boards, regional transit bodies, all of that. There are many, many places where we might, as residents, engage with the government that our community has put in place to manage something or other. Or as technologists, we might be able to go and improve the way that those government bodies meet us as residents. It's all a little bit head-eating tale, but we are part of these governments by our nature as people who reside under their care or thumb, depending on how they're doing. And we also have the opportunity with some of our specialized skills to contribute. And so that is sort of the civic tech perspective in a nutshell. I think one of the things that I discovered fairly early in my time starting to engage with governments was that public servants make tons and tons of design decisions, probably more than the entire design industry. And that means that I end up thinking of everybody who reorganizes a form letter to make it more understandable or more accessible, everybody who creates good signage for a counter, where people can go and get a permit or sign up for a class or whatever the thing might be. Everybody at a court who tries to make process easier for people without lawyers to understand. They're doing design. Most of the time, they are doing it without the kind of support that designers in industry might have by a long shot. So there are getting to be more. It thrilled me earlier this year to meet the UX practice lead for the city of Philadelphia, which is a very industry legible title. And she was someone I didn't know at all and who hadn't come into civic tech kind of through the networks that were common in the early 2010s. And it was so fantastic to see that happen with official design staff in a big city like that, but it's still not as common in smaller cities, in some state governments, and a lot of county governments to have any official design staff. And there may not be hiring and management mechanisms set up for designers specifically. Sometimes design software can be really hard to come by. We're trying to get some licenses for Figma, where I am consulting at the courts, and it's a month-long process. There may not be environments in the whole tech stack where designers can play around with things. There may not be just a lot of familiarity with talking about design in design language or talking about strategy. One of the most interesting barriers that we come up against over and over again is usually a myth that user research is actually illegal, that you will get in a lot of trouble if you talk to constituents in a mode that is not a deliberative community feedback mode. So I see a lot of my work as offering whatever's useful to them from design practice and from design community to the public servants who make these really consequential design decisions. Every time somebody comes into the waiting room, it shifts the focus. That's a fun little Zoom bug. Working on institutions, which is kind of, thinking of civic tech at large, I've had to think a lot about what is an institution, and why might that be different from working at a company? And I think part of the thing, we talk about scale a lot in Silicon Valley, and obviously there's really positive and negative aspects to that. But institutions are things that act on us and are part of our lives at scale and over time. So something like, even a strong local restaurant might be a minor institution, but something like government or medicine or education, these are all kind of society level institutions that affect millions of people over, and you start to think about the time scale, and you easily move from months to years to decades and sometimes centuries. So we're trying to shift the practice of institutions that have often existed for centuries, especially for government. It's not easy, so I want to tell you a little story about an institution and what institutional belonging means. This is me. Some time ago, please don't do the math, but that's 1990. I'm in Japan on a summer research fellowship, and I think I'm doing some tourist thing in this picture. But one of the terms of my research fellowship was that I had to come back and write a paper. So I was studying linguistics, and I studied feminine speech in the southern district of Japan called Kansai, which encompasses Kyoto, Osaka, Kobe. And I came back and I wanted to find a particular Japanese language reference to cite and finish my paper. And I went deep, deep into the scary stacks of my university library to find this book. And it's one of those scary OpenStax libraries where you only flip the light on for the little tiny row of books that you're in. So I was here, I had the only light on the floor. I finally found the book on the bottom shelf, and it was so cool to finally find it. And I realized that probably not that many people had looked at it. So I went and looked to the title page where they used to put the paper envelope that had the little cards in it. And I looked at the card to see who else had checked it out, who else had been involved in Japanese linguistics. And there was nobody on the card. And this was 1990. And the book had been published not that long after World War II, before 1950. And it looked like it had been acquired soon after publication. So this institution had chosen to buy a resource because somebody who was a member of the institution was going to need it someday. Nobody had needed it for 40 years, but here it was for me. And I sort of got chills from this sense of the care of this institution for me. Now, you could say a lot about the problematic nature of membership in this particular institution, which was a fairly elite university. Even a few years before I was there, a woman wouldn't have been considered part of the membership of the university. But for the people that it recognized as members, there was a mission and there was a length of time over which they would set things up so that these people could get what they needed to do their studies. I've remembered it for a long time, and I use it often as a metaphor for the kinds of things institutions do and that are really difficult for our kind of Silicon Valley methodologies to deal with. Oh. So was it design that they bought the book? I don't know. Was it something else? Was it mission? Was it policy? Probably a combination of both. And I want to talk a little bit about policy. If you happen to be on some of the pre-emails, you received the policy chapter, which is chapter 9 from my little book, A Civic Technologist Practice Guide. And policy is a really important thing that I grapple with as I'm trying to bring design practice and design community to public servants. It's a constant in their lives. And there are a couple of interpretations of that term that are important. So first of all, your specific administration, meaning whoever's in power at a political level, or your agency's interpretation of how to apply laws and regulations. So there's kind of a stack of formality, and at the top is the actual statute. And then there's the policy, which is how they interpret the statute. And then there's guidance and regulation, which are more informal. You can still get in a fair amount of trouble for not following guidance, but not nearly as much as not following law or policy. But it's also an entire discipline which has academic departments and books and all of that architecture that's about just the ways a government or another institution solves a problem or accomplishes a goal. So we want less people in poverty. We're going to set up a policy in order to achieve that. One of the most interesting examples happening now, where we're seeing really rapid and consistent policy changes around cannabis in the United States. So as of about 1995, it was fully illegal everywhere. As of now, it's legal for adults for any purpose and taxed and regulated in several states. Legal for medical use in all except a few states, and still fully illegal in a couple of other states. And there's a number of interesting policy questions around that, like if an area has decriminalized marijuana use, what should they do about people who are convicted in the past? And as people who work inside of these institutions, one of the biggest questions that we have to deal with in figuring out what to do is whether the existing policy favors what we want to do. So I've heard for a long time from people who want to help expunge convictions, clear people's records. And this is a really useful goal. It affects many aspects of people's lives if they can have a clean record with the court system. However, if you are in one of the few states where, say, where if you want to expunge marijuana convictions where the substance is still fully illegal, it basically can't get beyond a thought experiment. And that could be a useful thought experiment, but it's a good idea to be really clear about how far you can get. There is the idea of a messy policy that might favor what you want, an administration that hasn't sorted it out, a policy that sometimes allows what you want. One of the very best situations for designers to work in is when there's a policy that really favors your work, but the implementation isn't very good. So, politicians, political leaders are on record as saying yes. There's a great example from Code for America's Get Cal Fresh, where California has a very favorable policy towards broad food aid, and stated by successive administrations. And yet the process of getting signed up for food benefits is really difficult. That gave folks from Code for America a lot of room to work and to advocate and to actually create interfaces that worked better for people who are in that process. The fourth bullet is a little bit harder. So you have a new administrator who's excited about something, but policy hasn't been set for it. It hasn't been written down, and it hasn't been kind of socialized through the political and internal processes. This is one of the biggest constraints in working with institutions. We can't just walk in and say, it would be better if this. And if we're in situation number one, we may need to do political work before we're really in a situation to do design work. I like to think in any civic situation, and maybe it's good in other design situations too, what's my goal and where can I act for different goals? So if I want to relieve pain for end users, I might do something very different from if I wanted to free up capacity for the people who maintain the system or who serve the end users directly. Or if I really wanted my changes to last. One of the biggest things that happens in government institutions is there's an election. And if my changes were part of an initiative of the previous administration, new sheriff in town might just decide that we're stopping that now. So how can I make my changes last? And maybe how can I make sure that I have partnership and support and access to work on the actual, maybe the systems or with the people. I want to talk a little bit about my current project at the courts, and then I think we're going to go into breakout sessions. So I'll go quickly. California court system is really large. We have 38 million population. We have about 7.5 million court cases every year. And in about 80% of cases on the non-criminal side, there's at least one party who doesn't have representation from a lawyer. It's a really difficult situation to be in, but very common because legal services are so expensive. This is on the left, the state of the California judicial branch's web properties. And on the right, a list of court forms. The California courts manage official forms, which were an incredible advancement in the early 2000s over everyone having to write their own legal documents for every time they wanted to do anything with the court. But at present, they have close to 1,200 official forms, and they don't employ a single designer. But there's an interesting policy which came into play in the mid-2000s, which is that every court of record for a county, so every county trial court, has to have a center called a self-help center or an access center or something like that, where anyone, regardless of income, can go and get basic legal help with filling out forms and with understanding process. So that means there's a policy and some action on it favoring better access to justice for self-represented people. But implementation is tough. There are long lines at those centers. The information that's available if you can't drive to CART and park and wait in line and talk to somebody isn't that great. So our team went and did some research. Our host is second from right, and the rest of us we're visiting, between us, we visited about 20 of the 58 county trial courts in California. And we found a lot of this kind of stuff, a lot of make sure you don't mess up and stay in line and be careful. We also found these incredible paper-based organization systems behind the scenes. And we ended up starting to build a website, which is now into beta. And if you're interested, I'll share the link later, but I'm not going to give a demo because of time. But building a website meant we are working on plain language procedural content. That phrase has a lot in it. It's a lot of partnership with attorneys and talking about how we might change the definition of accuracy to be less of the law school precise and comprehensive definition and more of the UX, the end user takes away an accurate impression definition. We've been working on form filling instructions and referral to the right forms. We've been helping people figure out which courthouse they can file a particular thing in, because while we've got 58 courts, between them they have about 254 or 256 courthouses. And they don't all take every type of filings. We've made a better app for looking up which form you should use, and we've been working on, with some other partners, a fine reduction app for people who have traffic fines and have difficulty paying them to quickly get a judge's determination to reduce those fees. So the website we're working on looks like this. And a lot of this is, mundane but life impacting stuff. If you need a divorce, if you need a restraining order, if you need to deal with an eviction from either side, you're working in the civil court system. And the civil court system doesn't guarantee representation, sometimes guarantees translation or interpretation in the courtroom, and can be pretty opaque. So we start with some simple things like, what are the components of this court process for getting a divorce? And what does the timeline look like for both people? Now, I'm talking about the most basic design mechanisms around web design. These are, in fact, mobile responsive, which I'm guessing is a question I would get. Basic web design to make information about an opaque process really clear. But it also means we're helping implement a new CMS and building a design system based on the US web design system, putting in place release and staging processes, coaching folks across the central body, the Judicial Council on digital practice, and really excited. This is sort of one of those things that can be one of the biggest wins, establishing a web content attorney position, which is someone who has the authority of being an attorney, but is also experienced with web content and how to present things to users. The courts didn't know that they needed a position like that. And it became clear after a few months of our work that they do, and that this is going to be a permanent need to have someone who, in the digital channel, interprets legal information toward people who are not trained in the legal system. And this means that we start to chip away a little bit at the difficult access to civil justice, and we get more people going all the way through their cases. One of the trickiest things we've been dealing with in our sort of North Star and why we decided to build a website is that people can't figure out where they are in their court case or how to take the next step, even if they've managed to start it effectively. So we're just into beta and we're hoping to see more data, but it's looking good for some of this. And then this lets the assisters in those centers, instead of helping people fill out the most basic paperwork, help people who have bigger challenges or who have more difficulty with filling out the most basic paperwork. So I want to kick it into discussion, and I believe I'm going to ask my host to jump into audio and say that I'm right, that we're going to go into breakout rooms. And I prepared a little list of questions to think about with respect to policy and working on issues through design.
That's correct.
I'm so glad.
So we'll do that. We should probably make a few minutes of space for Q&A in case
You're
folks have to
right.
process anything before they
Okay. I
wanna
forgot to put in a
jump
slide for that, so.
No sweat. So we'll take 5
Okay.
minutes now for folks who
Okay.
have some questions for Cyd based on what they've heard.
Yeah.
I'll give another plug for the notes in case folks are wanting to
I'll pop out of screen share for
reorient
now.
themselves. And you're welcome to ask questions in the chat if that's easier for you, or in the Q&A. I'm just going to read off the two that came in so far. So first is, and Cyd, you can see this as well in the notes, but I'll say them out loud for the sake of folks who are on phone or who aren't seeing the notes. First, how are you balancing work with for-profits who are in the space that quote unquote compete with court and nonprofit players? And another question that I think weaves nicely is, for folks who are coming out of the industry, the tech industry, and into civic tech or into government services, I assume, what challenges do you see for this transition?
Probably somewhat separate. So there are important for-profit players in every space that I know, and there's a specific category of for-profit players that are kind of government vendors. There are fantastic ones and terrible ones. In the court system, for example, Tyler Technologies, which bought Socrata, if you're familiar with the sort of civic data ecosystem, is a really big player, and it provides court management systems. So it's a special flavor of case management to courts all over the country, and it provides e-filing services, meaning you can send in your filing usually by email, is what it actually is, rather than bringing your papers to the clerk's office in duplicate and getting them stamped. That is a for-profit company. I don't see that as a bad thing. They're being a part of the infrastructure and the ecosystem. I don't love everything about a lot of their design, but I've been starting to try to get to know some people there and you know, see if I can also expose them to some of this. Then you've got, there's a whole access to justice ecosystem, which is just kind of connects up to the mainstream civic tech ecosystem that mostly serves the executive branch. There's a lot of open source pieces. There is an open source document assembly program that's gaining a lot of traction called Doc Assemble. Document assembly is a weird term, and one that I first encountered when I started working in the courts. What it is asking questions via a web interface and assembling the answers into a PDF document. The whole thing is kind of a hack because in theory, we should be able to just submit that data. But when you have something where a particular form provides a vehicle to communicate with a government agency, sometimes it's by statute that that form has to be used. And so going to the legislature to change that is a big lift. And so sometimes people just decide to use computers to, you know, hack it and hack it in the sense of, you know, get around that little restriction, because we can ask you a more friendly style of question that might be in the language on the form, get the right answer, and send back to you a fully filled out form, typewritten, which is nice, and have you sign it. But there are also some for-profit companies that do that. There are companies that are for-profit, but that provide forms to attorneys' offices as electronic things in bulk. I like a full balance in the ecosystem. I think some for-profit companies are probably necessary, but I also think that some stewards of key open source code and so forth are a big deal. We are benefiting from the open source US web design system, and my hope is that I can convince my partners that we contribute back the components that we've developed for procedural content, like timeline components and step components, to that so that there can be a kind of legal open source design system.
Cyd, I'm gonna bring up one other small question, and then I'm gonna urge us to go out and actually switch around, because I think this question about transitioning might be good for
Yeah.
reflections. But because we're in a space where most of the folks coming here are from design, maybe design justice or some more principled approach to their work. And
Oh,
at
thank
least
you,
conscious.
John. John is mentioning A2J author, which is another one.
Good plug, John. There's an interesting tension between what we think of as design and what sometimes egotistically gets thought of. Everything is under design. And then there's a question in the notes. What are your thoughts about prototyping policies, which in a weird way is the other side of the coin from a lot of this work?
Yes, I think there's some real promise in that if it can be done in a way that, harms are carefully mitigated. But it's interesting, right? If a web form can stand in for a policy and policy people want to try something different out that can be expressed that way, and it doesn't just have to be a web form, but I'm just using that because it's an easy thing to prototype. It can get you feedback on policy a lot faster than a typical policy evaluation cycle. So there is a whole stream of civic tech and civic design folks who have been partnering with policy people to figure out where is it appropriate to use some of the tools that the design industry has developed to create better policy development, more equitable, more testable. Policy development are usually the goals, sometimes faster. And one of the ways that we can help a lot is in tightening the feedback cycle. For example, I participated in a research study this summer that was about trying to get unemployment benefits during the pandemic. And because of who sponsored it and how it worked out, we ended up having an opportunity every week to tell stories to actual policymakers that we had heard from participants about what it was like. And it was really pretty grim in June, and they needed to hear these stories. But they and their staffs didn't have a way to collect the stories with the same methodologies that this group of kind of designer, ethnographer type folks were able to do. So sometimes bringing those things together is really, really useful. Prototyping, I think one of the warnings I have about prototyping is that a prototype can be a promise, and a lot of people take it as a promise. If you put something in front of them that works, it seems like it's real. In high resource Silicon Valley environments, we are often inclined to just throw things out, and that's fine. It's a prototype, it can be tossed. However, in lower resource environments, when we take something away, there may not be a way to continue it. And people can be really disappointed and feel even betrayed by the removal of a prototype that people found useful. So I caution to be careful about prototype rhetoric and be really, really clear about what it is. And even at the prototype stage, even if you're experimenting, you're showing what's possible, but think about what would be necessary to make it real production grade, supportable at whatever scale is appropriate to who you're working with.
Wonderful. I feel like that's a really rich pivot point or segue for us to now go into some breakouts. So if you don't mind pulling up that slide again with the discussion prompts, we'll have folks in groups of 3.
I do not mind.
And you'll all get to meet some folks here. Do as you will, and some prompts to kick you off in your discussion.
Yeah, so I was hoping that you would talk about something that is important to you as an issue you want to design for or do design for, and come up with a bold statement of something that you hope. And an example I will give is making a really difficult experience respectful. So maybe even making a court appearance or even an arrest respectful, or making a receipt of public benefits joyful, as perhaps it should be when our society is caring for one of its members in need, and we consider that a function. And then think about what you know about the policies that are close to it and where you might be able to act to make an impact.
Wonderful. All right, so we'll be in groups for about 10 minutes, and we'll come back, reflect, applaud, close out.
Okay, I'm moving you to your rooms and a little pop-up will come up. You just have to click accept or yes or the affirmative to go in. And you'll have 9 minutes.
All right. So it looks like we're all getting back into the main room, but I want to spend the next 5 minutes just hearing from everyone, and also by hearing, also writing in the notes, just what were some of the highlights from your different discussions. So it'd be great if you all could share some highlights. Did anything stand out to you? Feel free to unmute.
I'm happy to share.
Awesome.
Sarah, I was with S and oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the other person who was in our Claire. Yes, great. We were talking two of us had a death in the family over the last few months. So we were talking about the complexity of, you know, managing that and how it's like one person that has the legal right to take care of all this stuff, and just talking about how it would be great if that process for wrapping up someone's estate was simpler, if it was designed for low resource, low time, cognitive and financially resourced people in a much more friendly way. And maybe if it could even be, you know, kind of designed to allow for several people to be, if there's not contention. And, you know, this is often an issue in planning for end of life planning, is, you know, in case there's a battle. But anyway, those are just some of the topics that came up for us.
Thank you, Sarah. And by the way, I'm sorry to hear that. Anybody else who'd like to share?
I'll share.
Awesome.
I was my meeting was with Pia. Hi, Pia. So legal complexity, you know, or people dealing with the courts is a spectrum, right? It's from, you know, the very complicated, really need a lawyer, you know, all the way to the simple. I want to pay a parking ticket. I want to expunge a criminal record. Simple, I put in quotes, of course. Any simple problem can become something much more complex. But if you look at it as a big, complicated system that has a spectrum of possibilities, you know, there's an easy side and a hard side wherever you draw the line. My goal is to automate the easy stuff, which isn't done. We did a study with my organization last summer and found that only about 20% of the easy stuff, the 20 or 30 most common forms or processes that are used in courts have been automated. And it would be relatively cheap, you know, only $1 million or so, you know, for a couple of years to automate the easy stuff, the expungements across 50 states, the fee waivers across 50 states, the uncontested divorces across 50 states, so on and so forth. Almost all of these things have been automated in a couple of places, but not everywhere. And if you accomplish that, we call it the low-hanging fruit problem because it's easy to pick. We already know how to do it. I'm not saying it would solve all the problems in the whole world, but it would move the needle, and that's my goal.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else who'd like to add or share? All right, Crystal, go for it.
Yeah, so I guess we talked about a number of things. I guess one kind of theme we talked about is accessibility. So, I mean, I think on the one hand, I mean, you can refract the term in a lot of different ways, but we talked a lot about like how, for example, it can be difficult for people who don't have a tech background to really have a handle on like what happens on the back end or in design, but we also kind of thought about what it would mean to take disability seriously with designing technologies, especially since I think a lot of organizations like paying lip service to accessibility and talk about making it a priority, but when push comes to shove, somehow like there's just no money for it or no like institutional capital.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Cyd, Danny, and Victoria for some closing thoughts.
Cyd?
I am here.
A word.
I'm clicking buttons. So moving past our share out, thank you so much for those rich discussions. Just a little promo for Civic Tech that there are a number of common types of projects, and I think John named a really interesting kind, which is tools for the government agencies and the constituents that need their services. There's also direct service delivery and infrastructure projects and a lot of work around mutual aid where people can support each other without the involvement of a government agency. And some of the ways to get involved, I've added more in the notes, but you can look for Code for Your City in the US or Code for All outside the US. Again, in the US, there are multiple government digital groups. There are quite a few product companies and consultancies and a foundation infrastructure that funds different efforts from research to company startups. So there's a lot there. I've put more in the notes, and I just want to thank you and turn it back to Danny for our final slides.
Thanks, Cyd. Thanks for being here. Thanks to everyone else for being here too. We might end a little early. Have a little breath of fresh air and some water to get out of here. Well, the only last bit is to check out the notes. There's a lot of rich resources listed there. There's a whole lot of lovely folks here who have shared their contact info and what they're up to. So if you haven't done so, I encourage you to do so. And I think, yes, I think it's important that maybe either you or Pia have the last note. I'll just give a shout out to what Claire added, that thanks for mentioning non-US resources. We apologize for those for whom this was a bit too early, but there are a number of folks in the UK and South Asia and either farther another direction or in the time zones that wanted to be here, for which this was the best, and it's also recorded. So one last item from me, and then I'll hand it back to you, Cyd, for any final reflections or acknowledgements is, as I mentioned, this was partly organized through the Design Justice Principles at Work working group, which is actively trying to figure out how we bring justice and equity into professionalized workplaces, where you have to deal with careerists, where you have to deal with folks who put their professional ambitions ahead of and above their social movement commitments. So a hard place to be, but you can check that out in designjustice.org and find your way into it. I'll actually just drop one last tiny thing in here for folks to read about some of our recent work. Back to you, Cyd, for any last thoughts, reflections, or a haiku, dare I imagine.
On the fly, I will just thank Himanshu and Jim and Nicole, who were the participants in my breakout. We had a great discussion, and I'd also like to shout out the Beck Center at Georgetown University, which was a grantor of my book and allowed me to finish it in paperback, and also is doing a lot of field building work in this area. So they have interesting workshops and public resources. I will drop that into the document as well. And if anybody wants to talk further, I am on Twitter usually multiple times a day. So at me or send me a message. And I'm very excited to meet those of you I haven't met before.
Thank you, Cyd. And I just want to make sure to plug your book. Danny posted a link to it, and we're super, super excited. Please check it out and get a copy if you haven't already. And final question for you, Cyd. What if people are looking to get more involved in civic tech? I know there's a lot of resources mentioned, but any advice?
I mean, so much, but start simple and find a friend or a couple of friends. I think it can be hard and frustrating work, as rewarding as it is, and you need a little posse. One of the cool things that's happening right now is a lot of the brigade and open data organizations around the world are meeting remotely. So you can join almost anyone. And a lot of them meet weekly. So you can check out a whole bunch of civic tech cultures by looking up code for Tulsa or Chicago or Seattle, and go and visit one of their meetups one evening. And I was just talking with Nicole about there is code for Germany, and there are some analogous organizations depending on where you are as well.
Awesome. And with that, thank you so much. And it sounds like some folks will be hanging out to chat for a little bit. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day. And many thanks to Danny for organizing this and Victoria for all her help, as well as Cyd. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.